Well, so ARENA is very much part of the overall architecture of renewable energy development in this country. So the space that we fulfill is really from early stage research through application of that research in the real world, demonstration of it at a pilot scale, and then all the way through to near commercial deployment, not quite fully commercial, because if it were fully commercial, it wouldn't need our support. So there are other pieces that complement what we do. The RET, Renewable Energy Target in particular, is the important part that pulls through the mature technologies, but we're the ones who provide the support to the technologies that are not yet mature, and to provide that first mover project with some support. And the first mover project is going to be more expensive than once it's been done 10 or 20 times. So for example, if you are building a solar farm in Australia today, you'd have to pay a couple of percentage points more for bank debt than if you're building a wind farm or a gas-powered generator. And those 1 to 2 percentage points over a 25-year term are an enormous fraction of the cost, something like 30% of the total. That's just the difference in financing cost, because there's a different perceived risk. Now, if you're a building company, an EPC contractor that is building a solar farm and providing a warranty for its performance, you haven't done it in all likelihood before in Australia using Australian contractors. So what you do is put in a big contingency margin to make sure that you cover all of your unknown costs. And that additional contingency margin, again, adds pretty dramatically. If you're going out there and optioning land, you're doing it for a wind farm, pretty well-known option agreement. For a solar farm, well, it's only just being done for the first few times. So you can see all of these first-time type issues actually add up in costs. And so it's the very nature of those first-time additional costs that makes the technology as a solution uncompetitive for the first few years that they're being rolled out. So that's really the case for support very directly. But of course, there are a whole host of other benefits that have to do with the industry, new industry development, new supply chain development, jobs. I mean, one of the interesting things is Australia's largest solar farm, which we're supporting and AGL is building. Most of the project value, so 450 million total cost, most of that is being spent in Australia on Australian suppliers, Australian labour. And interestingly, the frames and brackets are being manufactured by a company that also is a car parts manufacturer. So same employees being reskilled, factories being retooled for a new industry. So you can see the obvious transition: old industry going out, new industry providing the growth and the jobs. So that's absolutely a matter for the government to resolve, and ultimately for the Parliament. ARENA and its funding are enshrined in the ARENA Act, and so unlike many parts of government, just because there is a policy in place to abolish ARENA and to take most of its new funding as a saving doesn't mean that it's a fait accompli. It actually needs to go through the Senate before there is any real impact. However, I should also emphasize that we currently have about $1 billion worth of projects that are committed. Only about a third of that funding has been spent to date, and the government is very supportive of continuing with those projects and has in fact provided the funding in the budget. And so we expect over the next several years, and these are long-term projects, to continue to push forward renewable energy, to make progress with new technologies, making solar cheaper, for example, making wave power more commercially viable, and so on. And that'll continue no matter what happens to ARENA. Well, that's an interesting question, because I actually think that they are not the obvious ones, in that they're not the ones that are generating energy. You've already got wind and solar, essentially commercially viable or very, very close to it. And so there are a whole bunch of ancillary technologies that are going to make the difference in terms of adoption rates and also long-term high penetration of renewables. Technologies like storage, energy storage, control systems, demand management systems. Most cheap forms of renewable energy are intermittent. But most of our loads that use energy, use electricity, don't have to be on all the time, don't have to be on demand. Things like heating systems, cooling systems, they could actually ramp up when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and they can ramp down if a cloud comes over or the gust recedes. So you can think about those kinds of technologies and users' preference for how desperately do I need this appliance right now versus how happy am I to have that service later on this evening. Those kinds of trade-offs, once they're fully integrated through clever control systems, I think will actually show us that the existing network has a huge amount of capacity, perhaps even more excess capacity than it already has, and is very well able to support renewables and even intermittent renewables at that. I'll give you another example, if you'll indulge me. The off-grid area in Australia is a very interesting one. So in Australia, the one area where electricity demand is growing is off-grid, and about a quarter of that demand is currently diesel-powered. That's very expensive, typically north of $250 a megawatt hour at the source, and so it is pretty easy to be commercially competitive with that high cost of diesel using either wind or solar. The trick is really good integration of diesel, because you're not about to get rid of it in the near term, with the renewables. So when you've got the hybrid system integrated very well, you can save money, have greater energy security. You don't have to worry about being interrupted by the wet season, trucks not being able to get through with diesel supplies, for example, and ultimately it'll lead to a more price stable, cheaper system. That is an export opportunity, because Australia has a lot of expertise in putting systems like that together. Well, some of it all is. So as I pointed out, the off-grid in the off-grid market, there are many opportunities that are. We ran a program that closed at the end of last year, got 72 applications for off-grid support, renewable energy, fossil fuel hybrid systems, all of them. In a substantial fraction of the cases, even though the off-grid systems have a whole bunch of early mover additional costs, just like on-grid systems do, despite that fact, and we are definitely still in the early mover high cost part of the adoption curve, despite that, a substantial fraction of them, once we started really digging in, either don't need a grant or their grant can be recouped. So in other words, they just need cheap finance. They don't actually need a handout because they already are commercially viable. So that's part of your answer. In certain market segments, off-grid, on-grid, if you're displacing new build coal, for example, wind is cheaper than a new coal-fired power station. So there are situations where renewables already are cheaper. I think the trick is to leverage on those, in other words, push systems out there where the economics work or where the support required is small, and that'll drive down those other costs, the supply chain costs, the finance costs, the contingency margins, the development costs, drive out the high costs that are inherent in anything that's new. Well, it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's no question that we have a world-class resource, particularly in solar, but also in wave, in wind. There's some geothermal potential there. So resources we're very well endowed with. We have world-class R&D, again, particularly in solar. We have a relatively high penetration rate of solar today. We have a wind farm industry. So the basic elements are all there for it to really take off and grow over the next couple decades. It's relatively easy to get to penetration levels like 20%. And in fact, South Australia is already there. It's already exceeded that. Once you get beyond, and you don't really need to do anything in order to get to 20%. Once you get beyond 20%, you have to start paying attention to some technical details and add some additional systems and so on. Once you do that, again, it's relatively easy to get up towards 70, 80%. So that's kind of the next step function. The last 20% is much more expensive. So if you actually want to get from 80% to 100% renewables, that's going to, with today's technology, that's going to cost a bundle. And I would suggest that it's unlikely that we'll get to 100% anytime soon. I think getting to 20% is both easy and is just going to happen on its own. When we go from 20% to 80%, which is obviously a huge jump, that will depend on policy, and it can happen over the next decade or two, or it can take another 50 years, and that's really up to us. There absolutely, and there are many different. There are as many different models as different countries, right? You've got feed-in tariffs, you've got efficiency and renewable mandates in many parts of the U.S. One of the things that I think we could and should be doing a better job at is taking away the incentive of the networks to build out more capacity. So there's absolutely a regulatory driven incentive today for the networks to build as much capacity as they can get away with. And that is why our energy prices have gone up so much in the last few years. It's all in the networks. And so if we can, and renewables actually play a big role here, there are places, call it fringe of grid or network constraints, where one option is to build more poles and wires, and another option is to put in some generation capacity. Renewables is often the cheapest in that context, or a combination of renewables plus a bit of gas or a bit of diesel, and yet that isn't really happening because not the mindset, not the regulatory framework. So we could save ourselves money and drive adoption that way.